Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Monday, January 26th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today will reach 69.7 degrees, with a low of 51.9, so expect a mild winter day perfect for getting outside. Coming up, we'll examine the factors that led Winter Storm Fern to knock out power for millions across the region and unpack how booming AI data centers are fueling debates ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. Plus, other key stories on global tensions, local innovations, and more. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. Winter Storm Fern is being called a once-in-a-generation winter blast, stretching from Texas all the way to New England. Ethan is with us now to break down what's happening. Ethan, what are we waking up to this morning?
We're waking up to a country still firmly in Fern's grip, Grace. Meteorologists have called this a, quote, monster storm, end quote, because it sprawled more than 2,000 miles from New Mexico and Texas up through New England, even brushing northern Mexico and Atlantic Canada. According to Al Jazeera and The Guardian, nearly 230 million people across roughly 37 states have felt some impact. The snow and ice are easing in some places, but the dangerous cold will hang on for days.
We keep hearing that this one is tied to a stretched polar vortex. What does that actually mean?
Normally, the polar vortex is a tight whirl of frigid air locked over the Arctic. This time, scientists say it got stretched and distorted, allowing chunks of that bitter air to spill far south over North America. PBS and Forbes both point to Arctic amplification, meaning the Arctic is warming around 4 times faster than the global average, which can weaken the jet stream that keeps that cold air corralled. Judah Cohen at MIT published work in July 2025 showing these stretched vortex events have become more frequent over the last decade, which he says is basically loading the dice for extreme winter outbreaks like Fern.
So how big was Fern, in terms of who was in the danger zone and what they actually saw?
At its peak, somewhere between about 213 and 300 million people were under some kind of winter alert, depending on how you count advisories and watches. The Guardian reports snow totals near 25 inches around Sweden Township in Pennsylvania, while farther south it was all about ice, not fluffy snow. From East Texas through the lower Mississippi Valley and into parts of the Carolinas and Mid-Atlantic, they saw up to an inch of glaze ice on trees and power lines. And even after the snow stopped, the National Weather Service warned of, quote, life-threatening cold, end quote, with wind chills down near minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the northern plains.
That kind of ice really hits the power grid. How widespread are the outages right now?
According to poweroutage.us data cited by Al Jazeera and Gulf News, more than 1 million customers were in the dark at the peak yesterday, Sunday, January 25th. That number has come down, but we're still talking about hundreds of thousands without electricity as of this morning, January 26th. Tennessee has been the hardest hit, with The Guardian and Atlanta's WABE reporting around 330,000 customers out. At one point, nearly half of Nashville losing power. Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Texas, Kentucky, Alabama, Virginia, and North Carolina all have pockets of significant outages as well.
A lot of people remember Texas during Winter Storm Uri and worry the grid is collapsing again. Is that what happened this time?
So far, the evidence suggests this is a very different story. Analyses shared by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, summarized in the Washington Post, and tech sites like Tom's Guide, say the big regional grids kept enough generation online. The Tennessee Valley Authority said its bulk power system stayed, quote, stable and secure, end quote, and that the real problem was ice snapping local distribution lines and trees taking out neighborhood circuits. ERCOT in Texas reported having around 125 gigawatts of capacity available against 83 gigawatts of demand, meaning Texas outages were mostly about local ice damage, not a system-wide supply failure.
And what about natural gas and fuel? In other storms, frozen wells and pipelines have been an issue.
This time, historic levels of gas and storage gave operators a cushion. Local outlets like LM Tonline and the Trumbull Times note there were some so-called freeze-offs, where wellheads or gathering lines seize in the cold, but nothing like the cascading fuel shortages we saw in 2021. That meant power plants could keep running even as demand spiked. Regulators are still going through the data, but NERC and FERC's early read is that fuel supply held up reasonably well.
We also know there's been a human toll. What do we know about deaths and injuries so far?
As of this morning, at least 12 deaths have been confirmed, and authorities fear that number could climb as more welfare checks are done. Gulf News and Al Jazeera report 5 people were found dead outdoors in New York City alone, apparently from hypothermia in the brutal wind chills. Louisiana's health department told PBS 2 men in Cato Parish died of exposure. Tennessee has recorded 3 storm-related deaths, and agencies cited by Global News and The Express mention fatalities in Texas and Kansas as well, including a 16-year-old Texas girl killed in a sledding accident. Wikipedia's running compilations also count at least 18 hospitalizations tied to crashes and other storm injuries.
Those exposure deaths are heartbreaking. Beyond the cold outside, what are the major health risks during these long outages?
One of the big hidden dangers is carbon monoxide poisoning, especially when people try to improvise heat. The National Weather Service and CDC have been warning, through local partners like ABC 11 in Raleigh, that generators should be at least 20 feet from homes, never in garages or basements. North Carolina's health department has been reminding families to install CO detectors on every level of the house and to avoid using charcoal grills, camp stoves, or even idling cars inside attached garages. After every major winter outage, we see tragic cases that could have been prevented with those precautions.
Let's talk about getting around. How badly has Fern snarled travel on the ground and in the air?
It's been a near-total logjam in a lot of places. Flight tracker FlightAware, cited by Al Jazeera and ABC affiliates, reports more than 19,000 flights canceled since yesterday and over 15,000 delayed, hitting big hubs like Atlanta, Reagan National, Philadelphia, New York's 3 major airports, Washington Dulles, and Boston. On the ground, Gulf News highlights a pileup involving more than 100 vehicles in whiteout conditions, and state police from Texas to the Carolinas have been dealing with crashes on what look like clear roads but are coated in black ice. With trees and power lines down and in some cases nearly an inch of ice on surfaces, over 20 states have urged people just to stay home.
And closer to the nation's capital and big cities in the east, how are schools and government offices handling this?
Federal offices in Washington, D.C. closed preemptively for today, Monday, after several inches of snow flipped to heavy sleet overnight, according to Gulf News. New York City schools, many districts in metro Atlanta, and most of central North Carolina, including Raleigh-Durham, canceled in-person classes, shifting either to remote learning or full closures, as reported by ABC 11 and The Guardian. In North Carolina, a mix of snow, sleet, and freezing rain started Saturday night, with winter storm warnings stretching into this afternoon. Officials there are saying it may take days before everything is truly back to normal.
Let's turn to the government response. What has the federal government done so far as Fern moved across the country?
President Donald Trump approved federal emergency disaster declarations for more than a dozen states on Saturday, January 24th, according to Al Jazeera and Gulf News. On Truth Social, he wrote, quote, "We will continue to monitor and stay in touch with all states in the path of this storm. Stay safe and stay warm," end quote. In a separate post, he questioned the climate connection, asking, quote, "Whatever happened to global warming?" End quote. Even as agencies like NOAA and the National Weather Service were emphasizing how a warming Arctic can actually drive cold extremes. FEMA, meanwhile, pre-positioned supplies, staff, and search and rescue teams, and internal memos described by AI-aided briefings talk about keeping disaster workers in place and building regional compacts to speed aid when the next big ice storm hits.
How about at the state level? What kinds of emergency moves are governors making?
Nearly 25 states plus the District of Columbia have declared some form of emergency, which speeds up everything from plow contracts to guard deployments. In North Carolina, Governor Josh Stein issued a statewide emergency declaration focused on preparation and flexibility rather than strict restrictions, and Durham County layered on its own local order, according to ABC 11. Across the region, the National Guard has been heavily involved. North Carolina put about 450 Guard members and nearly 180 vehicles into service, including high-clearance trucks to reach stranded drivers and move supplies to shelters. Georgia activated around 120 Guard members for road clearing, with several hundred more on standby, based on figures compiled by Wikipedia and local outlets.
Utilities are under huge pressure right now. What does the restoration push look like on the ground?
It's an all-hands-on-deck moment. ABC 11 reports Duke Energy alone has about 18,000 workers staged at roughly 20 sites across the Carolinas, including 1,000 people at a single operations hub in Raleigh. At the national level, the Department of Energy issued emergency orders under Section 202C of the Federal Power Act, giving grid operators in ERCOT and PJM permission to tap backup generators that normally sit idle, even if that means temporarily bypassing some environmental rules. Time magazine notes that can free up roughly 35 gigawatts of extra capacity from industrial sites and big box stores, everything from data centers to retailers like Walmart.
You touched on climate earlier, and the president's skepticism. How are scientists explaining a brutal cold snap in a warming world?
Climate scientists are pretty clear that a warmer planet does not mean the end of winter storms. It often means wilder swings. Outlets like Al Jazeera, drawing on NOAA and Associated Press reporting, explain that as the Arctic warms faster than mid-latitudes, it can weaken the temperature contrast that helps keep the polar vortex stable. That makes it easier for lobes of that cold air to sag south, especially when natural patterns like La Niña line up just right. Judah Cohen and others argue that what we're seeing with Fern is consistent with that trend, even if any single storm is also shaped by day-to-day weather variability.
Beyond the science, Fern's already sparking big policy debates. What are the main fault lines you're seeing?
One big fight is over what kind of power plants we should be building. The White House has been pushing a package under Executive Order 14156, framed as a national energy emergency, that would put roughly $15 billion into changing grid market rules to favor traditional so-called baseload plants like coal and gas, according to summaries circulated by policy watchers and reported through Washington-based newsletters. Supporters say that's about reliability, especially during extreme cold. But experts interviewed by outlets like Forbes, Nature World News, and the Breakthrough Institute argue the future grid needs more flexible, firm power, combining renewables with long-duration storage, advanced nuclear, and enhanced geothermal, rather than doubling down on old coal units.
And when officials talk about making the grid more resilient, what concrete fixes are on the table after Fern?
There's a strong push toward old-fashioned hardening stronger poles, better tree trimming, and in some cases burying lines. The Washington Post reports states like North Carolina, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania are using storm securitization bonds to finance that work up front, with regulators claiming long-term savings of nearly 20% on costs. In Texas, LM Tonline notes that ERCOT and lawmakers are looking at mandatory battery storage reserves and more aggressive winterization of gas wellheads, building on reforms after Uri. And nationally, the 2024 International Energy Conservation Code is proposing tougher freeze protection standards for southern buildings, so homes can hold heat longer during outages.
It's not just the grid, though. How is Fern changing the way we think about communications and basic services?
Communications regulators are trying to avoid the kind of blackout where you lose both power and cell service. AI summarized policy briefs point to the FCC's Mandatory Disaster Response Initiative, which can force wireless carriers to let customers roam on rival networks during major emergencies, so a downed tower doesn't isolate a whole town. Some cities in Virginia, like Charlottesville and Arlington, are stepping up enforcement with fines for uncleared sidewalks, treating walkability as a safety measure so people do not have to step into icy streets. And in states like Georgia and South Carolina, lawmakers have pre-approved weight and hour limit waivers for trucks during winter emergencies, making it easier to move fuel, food, and road salt when they are needed most.
For people still dealing with outages or brutal cold this week, What should they be bracing for over the next few days?
The worst of the snow and ice is fading, but the cold is not. Earth Sky and Canada's Global News emphasize that this Arctic air mass is like a siege. Temperatures and wind chills will stay dangerously low for much of this week, especially where power is still out. That means folks need to be thinking in terms of days, not hours checking on neighbors, especially elderly or unhoused people, paying attention to local warming centers, and conserving heat where they can. And with the economic damage already estimated in the billions, it will be a long recovery for small businesses, schools, and families whose homes were damaged by falling trees or frozen pipes.
When you step back, what early lessons are energy experts and emergency planners drawing from Fern?
One clear takeaway from NERC and FERC's preliminary assessments is that generation largely did what it was supposed to do, while trees and ice did most of the damage. That pushes the conversation away from blaming any one fuel and toward investing in local resilience, smarter grid design, microgrids for critical facilities, and better coordination between utilities and city foresters. Fern also underscores that climate adaptation is not abstract anymore. Storms are repeatedly testing the same weak points in our infrastructure. As one analyst put it to the Washington Post, this storm was a warning shot that we will keep getting until we rebuild the system for the weather we actually have now.
A sobering picture, and a lot for policymakers and families to absorb. Ethan, thanks for walking us through it.
Anytime, Grace. We'll keep tracking the cleanup and what it means for the next big storm.
Our second big story this morning is about AI, but not the apps on your phone. It is the giant data centers behind them, and how they are suddenly a midterm election issue. Reporter Chloe Martinez is with us. Chloe, what changed to make this such a hot political fight?
The big shift is that AI data centers have moved from something abstract to something people feel in their monthly bills. NPR's Deepa Shivaram said on Morning Edition today that these facilities have become, quote, the new cost of eggs, end quote, in midterm rhetoric, especially in states like Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Virginia. According to NPR and its partner WKAR at Michigan State, voters are linking these resource-hungry buildings to higher power prices, environmental worries, and fears about grid reliability. And what is striking, Grace, is that this backlash is cutting across party lines, bringing progressives and conservatives into the same town halls.
For listeners who do not live near one, what exactly are these AI data centers, and who is building them?
Think of them as enormous windowless warehouses packed with servers that run advanced AI models around the clock. Hyperscale players like Microsoft, Google, Amazon Web Services, and newer outfits such as OpenAI and Elon Musk's xAI are racing to build enough capacity to handle models like GPT 5.2 and these so-called agentic systems that book travel or manage corporate budgets on their own. The Data Center World newsletter reports that Wall Street and global investors see these buildings as the backbone of the next computing era. They point to deals like NVIDIA's roughly $20 billion purchase of AI chip startup Grok late last year, and SoftBank's roughly $4 billion buyout of infrastructure firm Digital Bridge as signs of a massive long-term bet.
Give us a sense of scale. What are some of the biggest projects underway right now?
They are staggering. Data Center World says xAI is expanding a campus in Memphis, Tennessee, to nearly 2 gigawatts of computing capacity, which is in the ballpark of a large nuclear plant's output. In Wisconsin, Vantage Data Centers just broke ground on the $15 billion Stargate project, about 900 megawatts tied to OpenAI and Oracle. You have Microsoft announcing a facility in Grand Rapids, Michigan, plus a roughly $400 million co-location site outside San Antonio, Amazon Web Services pouring money into Covington, Georgia, and a UK-based company called Nscale landing an $865 million 40-megawatt deal in North Carolina. Industry analysts say taken together, these kinds of projects will use as much electricity as hundreds of thousands of homes and are helping drive utility construction spending up more than 20% heading into this year.
And voters are connecting that building boom to what they are paying at home. How much have electricity prices, actually climbed.
The Federal Energy Information Administration, the EIA, says average residential power prices rose about 25% nationwide between 2020 and 2024. Their short-term outlook projects another 4 to 5% bump this year in what they call data center corridor states like Wisconsin, Ohio, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Earlier, those jumps were mostly tied to volatile natural gas prices during the Russia-Ukraine war, delayed recovery of past fuel costs, and investments to harden the grid against extreme weather. But more recent analyses, highlighted by outlets like Utility Dive, say the new driver for 2026 is the sheer scale and speed of AI data center demand.
How do we know AI is really pushing those new increases, especially on the grid side?
You can see it in the wholesale markets. PJM Interconnection, the regional grid operator that covers much of the Mid-Atlantic and parts of the Midwest, reported that its 2025 to 2026 capacity auction cleared at around $330 per megawatt day, an eightfold increase from earlier auctions, largely because data centers added more than 5,000 megawatts of new demand while older coal and gas plants were retiring. In Virginia, the State Corporation Commission signed off late last year on Dominion energy rate hikes that will add about $11.25 to the average monthly residential bill, roughly a 6 to 7% jump, and the order explicitly ties much of that to transmission upgrades for Northern Virginia's dense data center cluster. A state watchdog there, the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission, has said those facilities account for nearly all projected demand growth through 2040. And in Ohio, regulators approved new tariffs for AEP Ohio after developers floated roughly 30 gigawatts of potential data center load, which could have shifted billions of dollars in grid costs onto regular customers if utilities had not carved out special rules.
Regulators keep saying they are trying to shield households from picking up the tab. What kinds of protections are they putting in place?
The main tool is creating special rate classes and long-term contracts so that giant customers cannot just walk away and leave everyone else with the bill. In Virginia, according to filings cited by Wisconsin Watch and Utility Dive, the SCC now requires so-called take-or-pay deals that run 14 years, forcing data centers to cover roughly 85% of their transmission capacity and about 60% of their generation demand, whether they use it or not. Ohio's Public Utilities Commission has similar 8-year commitments after an initial ramp-up period for loads above 25 megawatts, and Michigan's Public Service Commission approved a tariff called Rate GPD for 100 megawatt-plus users, with 15-year terms, minimum payments around 80%, and steep exit fees if a project bails early. In Wisconsin, for that 900-megawatt Stargate campus, Wisconsin Public Radio reports that Vantage signed a special contract with We Energies to underwrite 100% of the power infrastructure it needs, plus about $175 million in impact fees for water, sewer, and local grid upgrades. Pennsylvania lawmakers are now debating House Bill 1834, which would go further by letting regulators charge impact and exit fees, and by rolling back older sales tax exemptions on data center equipment to fund low-income bill assistance.
If companies are being told to cover so much, why are residents still so angry?
Because even if the data centers are paying for their own wires, everyone still pays for a more complex, more expensive system. The EIA and researchers at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory note that supply chain problems have tripled costs for transformers and some grid hardware since 2022, so every upgrade is pricier. Utility Dive, citing PJM's independent market monitor, says uncertainty about how many data centers will actually connect is responsible for roughly 40 to 50% of about $16 billion in recent auction costs. And while new rate classes insulate some of that, the broader modernization still ripples into residential bills. Politically, groups quoted by Wisconsin Watch and The Washington Post frame it as corporate overreach. They argue that big tech is consuming scarce power and water while ordinary families are told to conserve and pay more.
That anger is not just about bills, though. What are people on the ground worried about besides the money?
Local activists talk about a mix of blackouts, water strain, and community character. In Port Washington, Wisconsin, where Stargate is going up, Wisconsin Watch and Wisconsin Public Radio describe yard signs and public meetings warning about grid overload, diesel backup generators, and the strain on Lake Michigan's water. An organization called Great Lakes Neighbors United is pushing a recall of Mayor Ted Neitzke over how the deal was approved, demanding more transparency about future phases. And late last year in Lewiston, Maine, voters flat-out rejected a proposed Tier 3 AI data center, which Data Center World says has become a cautionary tale for developers who assumed communities would welcome any tech investment.
Let's talk about the politicians now. Who is leading the charge against this rapid build-out?
One of the loudest voices is Senator Bernie Sanders, the Vermont Independent. Democracy Now! And Data Center World both covered his December proposal for a national moratorium on new AI data centers, where he accused, quote, oligarchs, end quote, of using public grids to run automation that could also erase jobs. On the right, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has championed an AI Bill of Rights in his state legislature that would give local governments veto power over projects that threaten water supplies or drastically change neighborhood character, pushing against federal attempts to preempt state control. Meanwhile, Democratic Senators Elizabeth Warren, Chris Van Hollen, and Richard Blumenthal have opened a federal inquiry into companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Equinix, pressing them on their role in that roughly 25% jump in electricity prices since 2020. And Republicans such as Florida Congressman Brian Mast are pushing the AI Overwatch Act, framed by Notice.org, as an attempt to link data center growth with national security by tightening congressional oversight of AI chips and exports.
How is the White House approaching this, especially after that big One Big Beautiful Bill Act last summer?
President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act, often shortened to OBBBA, is mostly known for tax and border provisions, but it has huge energy implications. The law, which passed as House Resolution 1 and was signed on July 4th of last year, makes many Trump-era tax cuts permanent, eliminates federal tax on tips and overtime through 2028, and adds new breaks for car loans and child savings accounts, while also putting tens of billions into border security and raising defense spending. Energy-wise, as summarized by Ballotpedia and even Wikipedia's policy rundown, it rolls back most Inflation Reduction Act clean energy credits, phases out the solar investment tax credit, opens more federal land to oil and gas leasing, and lifts the debt ceiling by several $1 trillion. To respond directly to the data center backlash, the administration released a statement of principles this month with governors in the PJM region that requires tech firms to finance about $15 billion of new nuclear and gas plants through 15-year power purchase agreements, moving from state-level cost-sharing on wires to a national push for tech-funded baseload generation.
And what is the argument for that approach from the Trump side?
The pitch is that if big tech wants guaranteed around-the-clock power, it should pay for concrete plants, not rely on ratepayers to backstop them. On Truth Social, Trump wrote that the companies must, quote, pay their own way, end quote, and has floated emergency auctions that would force them into long-term contracts with private power developers instead of leaning on residential subsidies. Supporters, including some think tanks on the right, say that could ease pressure on wholesale markets like PJM over time. But critics interviewed by The Guardian and The Washington Post point out that OBBBA pairs those corporate-friendly tax changes with nearly $1 trillion in Medicaid cuts and hundreds of billions less for SNAP food assistance, plus new work requirements, which they call a cruel trade-off at a moment when many low-income families are facing higher utility bills.
You mentioned federalism tensions. How is this setting up clashes between Washington and the states?
States that have spent the past few years building their own guardrails do not want to see them swept aside. Policy shops like cleanview.co, the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Politico Pro are all warning about a looming, quote, federalism crisis, end quote, as the administration and Congress consider preempting some state siting and rate-setting rules in the name of national AI competitiveness. Several attorneys general in blue and purple states are already signaling they will sue if federal agencies try to override local decisions on where data centers go or how much they must pay toward upgrades. So you could see courtroom battles over whether FERC or state commissions really call the shots just as these plants come online.
Let's circle back to Wisconsin and that Stargate project, since it seems to symbolize this whole debate. What makes that one so central?
Stargate is almost a perfect case study. It is a roughly $15 billion campus in Port Washington that will draw about 900 megawatts when fully built, and Data Center World says it grew out of a broader $500 billion national concept that has since been scaled down but still looms large. The developers, Vantage Data Centers with OpenAI and Oracle as anchor tenants, have promised hundreds of jobs and say they are paying for their own infrastructure plus those impact fees. But residents worry that once the power lines and substations are built, future expansion will be hard to stop. Wisconsin Watch and Wisconsin Public Radio describe protests, recall petitions against Mayor Nietzsche, and demands for clear guarantees on water use, noise, and what happens during heat waves or winter storms. That mix of jobs, high-tech bragging rights, and very concrete local fears is what campaigns are seizing on.
Are we seeing similar political flashpoints in other states? Or is Wisconsin unique?
Wisconsin is just the most vivid right now. In Maine, voters in Lewiston last fall rejected zoning changes needed for a large AI data center, which Data Center World says shocked developers who thought the community would be eager for investment after economic struggles. In places like Virginia's Loudoun County or parts of northern Georgia, you're seeing quieter versions of the same dynamic, with neighborhood groups pushing for stricter noise rules, limits on diesel backup generators, or requirements to use recycled water. So while not every project is sparking a recall campaign, the era of automatic rubber stamps for big data centers seems to be over.
All this is landing just months before the midterms. How is it shaping the money and messaging in these races?
There is serious outside money flowing in. According to Politico Pro and CleanView, a pro-industry super PAC called Leading the Future has about $100 million, much of it from Silicon Valley names like Andreessen Horowitz, investor Joe Lonsdale of Palantir fame, and OpenAI co-founder Greg Brockman. And it is spending heavily to defend permissive permitting rules and to target regulators they see as hostile, including New York lawmaker Alex Bors. On the other side, a bipartisan group called Public First is aiming for around $50 million to support candidates who promise tougher AI safety rules and stronger consumer protections on energy. In battlegrounds, you see the issue front and center. New Jersey's new governor, Mikey Sherrill, campaigned on declaring an energy emergency to freeze or slow rate hikes. Pennsylvania and Ohio races are filled with references to PJM's warnings, and in Georgia there is even a debate about converting struggling film studios into data centers as Hollywood production wanes. All of that is wrapped in a national narrative about beating China on AI chips, like NVIDIA's H200, versus keeping energy affordable at home.
Is this really on track to rival inflation or immigration in voters' minds?
It might, because it is inflation's cousin. You can argue abstractly about AI competitiveness, but you feel an $80 or $90 utility bill every month. Deepa Shivaram at NPR called it a, quote, hyper-local revolt, end quote, that could actually eclipse broad inflation as a motivator in some swing suburbs and rural communities. The interesting twist is that it unites MAGA-leaning populists who distrust big tech with progressives who see climate and corporate power as core issues, which is not something you see with, say, immigration. And with OBBBA's tax provisions taking effect this filing season, people are going to be comparing whatever tax relief they get against those higher power and grocery costs right now.
When people walk into the voting booth later this year, what fundamental choice are they being asked to make on this issue?
At its core, the choice is how fast we want to chase AI leadership and who should pay the real-world costs. Some candidates are effectively promising a pause or strict limits until grids catch up. Others want to accelerate construction, but with tougher rules that tech giants fund new power and water infrastructure outright. And still others are betting voters will accept higher bills in exchange for jobs and national security arguments about staying ahead of China. There is no clean, no-cost option on the table. It is all about trade-offs between innovation, affordability, and environmental and community impacts. With the 2026 midterms just months away, the way people answer that question could decide not only control of Congress, but the shape of America's energy and AI landscape for the next decade.
A complicated fight over something most of us never see, but all of us feel. Reporter Chloe Martinez, thanks for breaking it down. Here are some other headlines. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is drawing fire for an unprecedented power play, serving simultaneously as America's top diplomat and acting national security advisor, a double-hatted arrangement not seen since Henry Kissinger. Critics, including former National Security Advisor John Bolton, warn one man may not have the bandwidth to steer both the State Department's vast bureaucracy and the National Security Council during an era of high-stakes geopolitical shifts. They fear that when one voice wears two hats, real policy debate can lose its headroom. The concerns come as Rubio readies landmark testimony Wednesday on Venezuela's future after the capture of Nicolas Maduro, a hearing energy giants like Chevron and Shell will monitor closely. Any remix of Washington's rules for Venezuelan crude could amplify global price swings, even as Rubio pushes an America First agenda that ranges from fresh Arctic governance frameworks to a newly minted Board of Peace meant to reshape diplomacy over Gaza. In Eastern Europe, President Volodymyr Zelensky says a new bilateral security deal with the United States is, in his words, 100% ready, policy cooked and plated, awaiting only a signing date. Speaking in Vilnius on January 26, he confirmed the document was finalized after 2 days of trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi that brought Ukrainian, U.S., and Russian military and diplomatic envoys together. Unlike past easily torn assurances, Zelensky says this pact offers enforceable guarantees for the next decade, covering arms deliveries, intelligence sharing, and cooperation across the defense industry. Once signed, it will go to the U.S. Congress and Ukraine's parliament for ratification, cementing long-term Western backing as the war nears its fourth year. Still, the road to peace remains potholed. Zelensky concedes fundamental disagreements with Moscow over territorial integrity, even as he links the agreement to a broader security architecture that includes a drive to join the European Union by 2027 to anchor economic stability. North of the border, Prime Minister Mark Carney is trying to keep trade tempers from going fully off the rails. On January 25, he stressed Canada has no intention of pursuing a full free trade agreement with China after President Donald Trump threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Ottawa makes a deal with Beijing. Carney says the recent preliminary understanding with China is only a narrow roadmap, lower tariffs on 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for reduced duties on Canadian farm exports like canola, all within the notification rules of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. With that pact due for renegotiation this summer, the standoff is jolting auto and farm supply chains, especially after Trump yanked Canada's invitation to his self-styled Board of Peace, and Carney used Davos to tout middle power teamwork to hedge against U.S. protectionism. In Congo's Ituri province, at least 25 villagers were killed by Islamic State-linked ADF militants who burned and shot civilians despite joint Ugandan-Congolese offensives. And in Cairo, lawmakers are drafting fast-track limits on children's social media use, answering President El-Sisi's call to curb digital chaos nationwide. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.